Thank you for inviting me here. Thanks to the Fundación Trames and Identitats, first of all. As you mentioned, I'm an architect and I'm doing research on adaptability and urban resilience. And in the book we published in 2012 with Yvette Masson, who is here in the first row, and urban philosopher Thierry Pacaud, was this article called Pirate Architecture. Today, I will not have the time to define architecture because it would be much too long, so I just ask you to understand it as the sum of city practices and their results that shape the fabric of our living environments of cities and territories. So I developed the pirate part of these processes, and as the title is quite catchy, it brings to mind many cliches. I will try to give you an overview of the subject and its context, trying not to be too reductive and not too boring, and then try to develop what the perspective it opens. It is no secret today that we live in an urbanizing world, and where the boundaries between the city and the countryside become increasingly blurred. And we can therefore consider that cities and territories today really embody our living environment. And cities and territories are a very important scale because they embody both the physical and the cultural political dimension of contemporary issues. And that multiple aspects today is very often forgotten. If we think that for the Greeks and the Romans, ancient Greeks and Rome, they had two words to name the city. The Greeks talk about polis and asti, while the Romans used urbs and civitas to denote respectively the material city with its buildings, infrastructures, and its walls, and then the other aspect was the citizens who populated it, living in communities and organized politically, constructing a common culture. Territories also express two complementary notions. In Greek, again, there is the word topos, which refers to mappable places, while chora means the existential places. Cities and territories embody this duality, this century-old concepts. They have contributed until recently to shaping contemporary cultures. For example, the Constitution of the Italian Republic, which was adopted in 1948, includes among its 10 seminal articles an article on the protection of the landscape. In that text, the landscape is understood both as a natural element of aesthetic and ecological value, but it's also understood as a remarkable cultural element which is meaningful for the societies who inhabit it. Today, this duality has disappeared. As the French geographer Augustin Berck demonstrates, if every place embodies both the material and the cultural dimension of the topos and the chora, the city material and existential, modernity has relegated the cultural parts to the backstage. The dominant urban and territorial models, which originated at the time of the Industrial Revolution and experienced some kind of hypertrophy in the last 60 years, continue shaping our living environments and are those of economic development, planning and modernity, basically. Exacerbated in the post-war period with the advent of neo-capitalism, they carry the ideology structured around a confidence in exponential growth, the collateral effects of which would invariably ensure well-being and social progress. the cultural dimension of the city has then been not only forgotten in this framework, but also often reduced to its market value, especially through heritage sites and the tourism that they produce. Today, if we see that the relevance of urban planning is often contested, or at least questioned, it is precisely because of the inconstancy of both economic development and the distribution of its wealth. The top-down responses that this development generates by means of marketing strategies and blueprint master plans are proving to be inadequate in the short term, which must be today able to respond very rapidly, increasingly rapidly, to unexpected changes in living environments. And this issue forces us to consider other economic models, as well as the need to rethink how to address local cultural resources, which, as Pierpaolo Pasolini pointed out since the 70s, have massively receded during the second industrial revolution. Well, actually, he says they have disappeared, but let's say receded to be for more prudence. According to many contemporary thinkers, including Italian geographer Alberto Magnaghi, who founded the territorialist movement, an incrementalist approach should be founded on cultural and material resources seen as the assets and the potential of territories, approached as action design sites. In light of these processes, the cultural dimension of cities and territories appears to be a crucial issue as a source of renewal in a system in crisis. But then what is exactly culture? What are the words to talk about it? Well, the definitions of culture vary a lot according to the fields concerned. However, they share the fact that they all refer to models around which societies are built. To give an example, I'll read you the definition of UNESCO. It says, in its widest sense, culture might now be said to be the whole complex of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features that characterize a society or a social group. It includes not only the arts and letters, but also lifestyles, fundamental rights of human beings, value systems, traditions, and beliefs. It's just a definition among others, but it reflects the difficulty of determining the extent of the meaning and of the word culture. And it also shows its vocation to embrace what represents and what structures a coherent set of reference. The dominant trend in politics, economy, and also in city making, and it's certainly the case in Europe, assigns the stability of this structure to the beneficial effects of constant economic development. And contemporary crisis shows us that it is precisely now this building of reference that is harmed, which means cultural practices. Current practices, of which sustainable development is a glaring example, focus on quantitative criteria and contribute to stimulating an allegedly sustainable economy, while divorcing its field of action from the territories concerned. But at the same time, and we saw it in the last presentation, a multitude of actors are becoming initiators of experiences that take into account the qualitative, cultural, and symbolic dimension of the environments they shape. Their work underlines and confirms that this regeneration is about city making as much as it is about cultures and the cities and territories they shape. French philosopher Michel de Certeau wrote that if in discourse the city serves as a totalizing and almost mythical landmark for socio-economic and political strategies, urban life increasingly permits the re-emergence of the element that the urban project excluded. How to define the culture that such a contradiction seems to represent? Well, American architect and urbanist Keller Easterling defines as pirate those special products that tend to exist outside normal practices and jurisdictions, that aspire to be worlds unto themselves and that are self-reflexive. Even though we can say that pirate architectures can be of many kinds, varied, they share the fact that they are outside of dominant practices. They claim self-autonomy to define tactics in a context of increasing constraints and regulations, to try to adapt to specific needs and aspirations. Easterling says that those pirate experiments claim to be innocent of politics, but that in reality these enclaves become political pawns and objects of contention. Empire and counter-empire, he says, are both swimming in the same water, using the same tools. One needs to use many different kinds of instruments. Many political consequences, even if they are the result of deliberate intention, they are rarely vetted and validated through official political processes. Therefore, resistance, too, might operate in these unofficial channels of pirates and other non-state actors. End of quote. But if the claim of autonomy to pursue a goal is setting oneself above or outside legal frameworks, outside regular practices, or in a situation of immunity towards them, what can define the mechanisms, the process of piracy that they represent? Well, if we take the etymology of pirate, etymology always is often based on true stories, so it can give us an insight. Pirates comes from the ancient Greek word pirao, which literally means to try your luck. This root is found both in modern Greek word pirama, which means experiment, and the word empiria, which means experience in the sense to have experience, to be experienced. And also the word pirasmos, which means temptation, and obviously piratia, piracy. So the mechanism of piracy can appear as follows. When the dominant trends don't address needs and aspirations anymore, the temptation of a cause beyond the conventional legal framework brings the pirate outside or above the law and regular practice. He is thus engaged in experimentation in an uncharted ground, because he's outside the system, in that the rejection of rules allows him to freely design the best way to pursue his goal and gaining experience. Therefore, we can say that in pirate architectures we have the pirates, the common temptation, the fact that they try their luck, experimentation, and then experience. An important thing in the mechanism is that the experience the pirate draws, having brought to light flaws in the hacked system and proposed alternative means for pursuing a goal, allows or may allow the same system to improve. Many historians, such as Marcus Rediker, American historian, pointed out that in its piracy, in its golden era between the 17th and the 18th century, was as much fought and repressed by the states, by the great world powers. Well, actually it was repressed since the Romans, since Cicero. It was as much repressed as it regulated the economy and contributed to the construction of new and progressive social, economic, and political ideas in the context of what Rediker calls the first globalization of economy. For example, many pirate societies of this golden era were offshore experiments imagined from scratch by groups of people. They functioned in democracy, established equal rights regardless of origin, religion, and sex, and had a fair distribution of wealth at levels that appeared in the politics of official states only centuries later. As stated by many authors, their history and the way it has been represented in literature, notably, the narratives of piracy served as a source of inspiration to the construction of modern societies. Now, I don't want to develop too much about the history of piracy in its golden age because we wouldn't have the time. But if I mention it, is to show that it's the most structured system can improve thanks to their pirates, because pirates, by developing in their cracks, both show their defaults and the ways to overcome them. There is maybe an image that can help us to understand this mechanism, and it's the contemporary one and more frequent of the hacker, fought by the system, often sued and sentenced by the establishment, but then hired by the same system that he hacked, because the expertise he developed helps the system to improve. Then we can see that and say that using the language of piracy helps us to see and to understand mechanisms that are in practice, that are more and more frequent as we can witness today, but for which we have very few words. In a moment when we talk more and more of alternatives and innovation, thinking about pirate architectures casts light on what an alternative really is and of what its role can be. If we make some etymology again, alter in Latin means other. An alternative would be someone who refuses to conform the norm and wishes to reveal the other in him or herself. This is a point of departure that allows the other to be encountered and to have differences heard in unison. Most alternative experiences are collective. Beyond permitting such differences to be admitted and recognized, the possibility of joint expression encourages each person to be aware of the extraordinary richness that results from collective gathering and affirmed singularities. In contemporary terms, alternative denotes an act of political protest, a stance against the establishment that is to be practiced and qualified as part of a lived experience. We speak of alternative movements in order to define these groups who try to live, produce, consume, or educate or love differently, and their paths mark a divergence from conformism. They propose a recalibration of what is to be considered normal, because their piracy offers an aside from what is imposed, normed, prescribed, and standardized. Well, we all have in mind a few highlights throughout history of alternative movements. They are not new. We can think about cooperatives, communities, Owen Fourier, libertarian colonies, hippies, collectively managed activities, up until today's eco-villages, self-built and self-financed housing projects, advocates for degrowth, transition, guerrilla gardeners, or other people who just try to live taking things more slowly. And those who oppose alternative movements, the establishment, accuse them of being marginal and refusing to obey the rules. Mostly, they do this in order to confine them to the minority status and to stigmatize them. But at the same time, the majority, which with its rules and frameworks, needs those pirates as a source of inspiration and knowledge in order to reinvent themselves and to adapt and to transform facing changes in living environments, changes in cities and territories precisely. Alternative movements have a long-standing history as generators of counter-culture and renewal of knowledge and social progress. Being alternative implies not only making a rupture or denouncing, but also proposing. Because the pirate's entry into alternative thus requires a critical mind and the courage to take a chance to risk something without being sure of the end result. It's to create problems, as Anna mentioned. Embracing the alternative responds to an intuition, the pirate's temptation to test another pirate experience. Many alternative adventures never truly construct what they had to build, what they tried to build, but they cannot be considered as failures, because all experience is necessarily useful to design cities and territories, and part of the pirate process of the cultural awakening that it represents. The pirate entry also helps us to understand the difference between alternative and innovation, which is another concept that we hear quite often. Because alternative, it's not exactly innovation. Alternative is not innovation. While alternatives represent something else than regular practice, something offshore, something pirate, innovation literally means to make new again, and it comes from the establishment itself. For this reason, facing contemporary crisis, the response we hear is often innovation, which is also often as optimistic and naive as it is carefree, because to make new again something that has proved to be obsolete is far from being harmless. Just to give an example, while experts have demonstrated that we have attained the peak oil, or that many primary materials are becoming scarce, at the same time the automobile park is increasing, flight traffic is growing, and paradoxically, the consumer society is militating in favor of green development, which indeed it's an innovation, but it's an innovation to stimulate growth and continue using more and more resources again. To imagine alternative ways, the experimental part of piracy is crucial. Where common trends aim to optimize practices that have been considered effective through innovation and sustainable development, experimentation tries radically new practices. Radically alternative experimentation embodies action research that can only be metaphorically offshore and literally off-system. Action research represents a rupture with conformism, a challenge to an order that is considered normal, a move away from what is imposed and standardized, from that which is normative and sets standards. Alternative experiments claim autonomy by being able to propose new radical solutions that conflict with the establishment and criticize common practice. As shown by Saul Alinsky, conflict plays an important role as a drive for change. In this conflict, the power struggle with the established order creates manifestations of resistance. And resistance, etymology again, comes from Latin resistere, which means to stand, to stop, to face. The term evokes a refusal to give in. The intention is to confront force with force. And as American architect Lebbeus Woods pointed out, speaking of resistance in architecture, he draws the attention to the ambiguity of the word resist. According to his reading, resist does not mean to dismiss or to reject. Instead, it implies a measured struggle that is more tactical than strategic. Resistance does not therefore arise from the preconceived, from the master plan. It is the sum of small incremental fights. And to resist, therefore, also implies the need to define what it is that you are resisting. It is the equivalent of structuring principles and organizing. It is the act of creating new reference. And it's no coincidence that over the last decade, manifestos have made their return in the public discourse on the city. By valuing experimentation, we question the nature of this resistance that is in the process of questioning old reference points and structuring new narratives. Now, if we begin to embrace design not only as an outcome, but also a process by which capacity is built through city making, then the special actions can also reconfigure economic processes. Piracy, hijacking, hacking, or borrowing urban spaces for unintended uses, substituting use value to exchange value, can create those temporary autonomous zones that Anna mentioned, TAS, as Akin Bey defined them, that subtract land from its market context temporarily and questions its status as a commodity. Recently, we saw the appearance of multiple alternative economies, from recycling, alternative currencies, information sharing, time banks, etc. Finally, what underlies many of these efforts is that they escape the dominant innovation approach, aiming at reactivating growth, to imagine alternative ways of gathering economy, politics, the social, and ecology. Now, many scholars have tried to study the boom of all these initiatives, but they have imposed mostly pre-existing frameworks on these initiatives, falling back on the old vocabulary of 20th century ideas, and most of them try to measure their capacity of innovation rather than trying to understand how they represent an alternative. These conceptual misunderstandings restrict, in fact, a promising arena of political possibilities. But some researchers started studying the capacity for renewal of this counterculture and their creative potential. To give an example, the French laboratory Gerfaut, which is in our network as a laboratory for urban counter-proposals, by analyzing the political possibilities of a multiplicity of urban imaginaries, representations, and interventions, they talk about the concept of hybridization as the construction of new multi-scale connections, new types of cooperation, inclusive processes, and participation. Those connections empower artists, architects, cultural activists, and ordinary citizens to become key players by inventing new practices and tactics, to claim their rights to the city, and to freely project alternative possibilities for urban life. This approach brings to light the references and the values of the alternatives, the critical components alternating between process and idea, impertinence and ironic, and carries the affirmation of the reconverged fundamentals engaging other methods of projection, other representation, other notions of politics, and also even the relation between culture and nature, other alliances. So and it will be my conclusion, facing increasing inadequacy and often the hostility of regular practice, more and more pirate politicians, architects, activists or citizens across Europe propose alternative solutions and counter proposals that divert, bypass, question and bend the rules for imagining new ways and lifestyles, new cities and new territories, basically. These initiatives are often isolated pirate experiments, which are both offshore by destination and at the same time at the heart of cities and territories, precisely where the city gives in. Networks, they reflect a real movement that, despite the variety of contexts, faces common needs and aspirations. They deserve to be collected, analyzed, and disseminated, as their experimental mechanisms are a valuable source of information for a public debate that should now be able to rely on the invention and the counter proposals carried by this pirate architecture.